Welcome to the first session, or one of the first sessions after our great opening. We're going to talk about strategies for protein diversification, and I'll talk a bit more about what that means in a few minutes. I'm going to guide us through the session. We'll have several elements. We talk through why protein diversification is needed, although I'll keep that to a minimum because Tim Satchinger already in his excellent opening talk basically made the case for why we cannot just rely solely on the way we currently produce animal products. And then we'll do a round of audience questions, actually. So this session requires, of all of you, participation and creativity. So we'll get to that. And then I'm very glad that we are tackling this question of how. Not just what, but how can governments actually implement and create strategies for more sustainable food systems. And we have a great panel for that with people who have been in the engine room of driving protein transitions in different levels of government, at the regional level, at the national level, at the European level, and especially also with an innovation lens. Very brief background, I'm Alex Holst. I work for the Good Food Institute Europe. We are an international nonprofit really focused on creating a more secure, more sustainable, and a more just food system. And we focus on this question of protein diversification. We work with scientists, with businesses, and with policymakers across Europe and across the world to advise them to make that happen, to make alternative proteins affordable, accessible, and delicious. Tasty for consumers. Tim gave actually a much more concise summary of our mission earlier today. The starting point for the session is really just the recognition, I think, that we all felt in the opening talk and the opening panel. Just continuing the way we're producing animal products is not sustainable. Tim mentioned the number of 70% increase in global demand for animal products by the middle of the century. Already now, animal protein production systems, they put an enormous burden, enormous pressure on land resources, on water resources, especially on the climate, on public health aspects. So just continuing with that will not be enough. And so this question on, okay, diversifying protein, what does that mean, comes to the fore. And we talked already, or we heard already a bit earlier today, what that could look like. It could mean more plant-based protein. It could mean eating more whole grain foods, eating more legumes. It could mean eating more plant-based alternatives to meat and dairy. It could also mean more new novel proteins like fermentation, like cultivated meat. And we're talking about diversification because it's not like an either or. It's not a switch from today to tomorrow, completely wiping out the way we've traditionally produced food. It's more of, okay, there's going to be a growing demand for meat. Where is that growing demand going to be supplied from? It cannot just be the existing sources. That's why we need to diversify. And the diversification question is, okay, how do we do that? So we'll start with the recognition that that's the challenge. And not focus too much in the next 90 minutes on which particular protein source is preferable, which particular protein source has certain benefits, certain advantages, certain disadvantages. That's definitely something to be figured out. And there are other sessions actually during this conference that will delve into those different protein sources. There's a great session this afternoon on microbial protein with this particular showcase of a Flemish success story. There's a session on plant protein supply chains this evening that I would encourage you all to go to. But we want to really focus on, okay, how can governments organize and coordinate this kind of protein transition and what kind of strategic approaches have already been developed. And so before we dive really deep into that during the panel, I do want to ask all of you to take out your phones or your computers and help us come up with some initial ideas and initial themes around protein diversification. So we're going to go briefly through 5 questions, displaying the answers here on the slides. And the first question is just a really open question: what should be key elements of a national or regional protein strategy? So imagine you're part of a government and a protein strategy has been on the box and should be developed, like what should definitely be included. So you can scan the QR code here on the slides, or you can also just in your browser put in the URL slido.com and insert the code, and then just start being creative. This could be any element that you can think of. It could be a specific objective that a protein strategy should definitely cover. It could be a theme, a topic that needs to be considered. It could be a principle, an organizing principle, maybe for such a comprehensive topic. And it could be a stakeholder group. And we see already the first ideas coming in. I see transition of farmers, the center right now. I see funding. We've talked about funding this morning a lot. A lot of different ideas. R&I again. Coherence, a policy demand we often have that is not always met. I think that came through in the panel this morning. Education at the center, cooperation. Those are great themes. I think the education bit, that's an interesting one for us, Evelyn, in the next panel to pick up how you've done that in Flanders. I'll give it a few more seconds. And yeah, we see a lot of elements that relate both to like policy, like what particular policy interventions, like funding mechanisms, transitioning fair prices, but then also more like all these different themes around sustainability, around health, around nature, around biodiversity. So there's a lot to cover. And I see education is at the center right now. That's a curious one. I think that's something we need to dissect, especially looking at Tim Searching's comments from earlier in the panel. But there being two schools of thoughts about the role consumer education actually can play in making transformative change. I'll say we stop here with this question, and would say the takeaway is there is a lot. There's a lot to consider. It's complicated. And we got back to these questions actually at the end of the session. So I will be shouting out some of the answers that might be different after we've listened to the panel. The next question is very similar. It basically asks the same question, key elements of a protein strategy, but it asks it about the European level. And so I would say let's interpret this question maybe that all the elements we just talked about and we just saw, they are probably still important, but is there something distinct, specific about the European, the EU level, when we think about a strategic approach to protein that should be considered? Is there maybe a competence at the EU level that makes it more relevant to interact there compared to at the national or regional level? And maybe there isn't. And we'll hear a bit more about this this exploration of what a European protein strategy could look like later on the panel as well. We have the European Commission here to talk about that. I see meat reduction as a big blurb in the middle. Autonomy, competitiveness. I think the autonomy point is really one that we hear a lot in discussions. It might not be feasible for a regional government to really try to be completely autonomous in terms of protein supply, but at the EU level, this potentially should be an ambition. Competitiveness with other regions, yes. Food security, taking into account the regional differences. These are great ideas. Move away from import. We've heard a lot about how much land footprint the EU actually has outside of Europe and what it does to biodiversity and nature. So this is something I would love to tackle on the panel. And we are nearing the 60 people mark. So I would say also we stop here. Some really good ideas we will pick up. Let's go to the next question. And the next question is more of a rating. So given all those different aspects and elements, how doable is it to unite all of them and actually create a comprehensive protein strategy? I believe you have a star system, so it goes from 1 star is very hard, 5 is very easy. So let's see how feasible we think it is to do all of that. And let's not get too discouraged, I hope. I'll see the harder side is winning at the moment. 2%, maybe one or two people who think it's very easy. I would love to talk to those people after the session and learn how they've done it. I hope it's actually our panelists, because they've actually started doing it. Okay, I think we are there. This result, I'll definitely want to compare the after result in about 60 minutes. And I hope that through our discussion we'll have shifted this distribution a bit more towards the feasibility, but I think we can all agree that it is a difficult task. Okay, so let's go to the next question. This is a binary one and about stakeholders and coalitions. So some stakeholders want to take really big steps forward. Others want to or believe in small incremental steps. What do you think? A protein strategy should include a narrow coalition of the willing, going ahead with a small group that want to move forward really quickly, and others will then follow later? Or do you think, no, we need really a broad coalition with all stakeholders from the beginning? Everyone moves forward at the same time, but with much smaller steps. Take your pick. And we'll see at this point. I believe we actually don't see the result for the second one, but we can probably deduce it. Luckily that this is a binary choice. So we're probably 50-50 at this point, which I find surprising. Interesting. Yeah, I'm curious to maybe we can do that during the audience Q&A, and Maria-Lisa can talk about it during the panel. Where does the narrow coalition come in? Great. Let's go to the last question. And it's about the different actors within the food system that need to be addressed. So there are many different actions that we need within the food chain for protein diversity, but really special emphasis should be put on one of those four: farmers, food processors and manufacturers, retail and food service, or consumers. And if you are inclined to say, this is a false choice, all of them are important, that might be true, but who do you think is really maybe neglected, like in our discussions, in different policy spaces? Most of the people in the room, I think, are related to either food policy or are experts on food science. What do you think we need to focus more on? Let's take a look. And we'll see consumers taking the lead here, farmers close behind. This is like a race. And this is, I think, a result so far that I think I would have expected based on discussions we sometimes have in Brussels, at least. I'm curious to talk actually about the bottom of the list. Like, is there something about the middle of the chain that we sometimes feel we sometimes don't talk about, but actually gives us quite a bit of leverage in making changes? And again, I think an example from Flanders there could be quite interesting to talk about later. But consumers being like hugely important, I think we've heard that also earlier on the panel. It can be a powerful intervention. We're going near 70, so I'm going to stop it there. Thank you so much for that. I think that gives us a lot of ideas to work with, and we'll pick up some of these themes during the panel discussion. And I would say we go straight into the panel. So we are very lucky that we have with us people, who have really thought about protein transition, protein diversification as part of their jobs. And I'll invite them one by one on the stage. I'll start with Evelien de Cupre. She is a policy advisor at the Flemish Agency for Agriculture and Fisheries and has been coordinating the work around the Flemish protein strategy. So thank you so much for joining us. Next, we have Simone Eysink. She is team coordinator for food at the Dutch Agricultural Ministry, also Ministry for Nature and Food Quality. So thank you so much. And she will really bring us a perspective not just about protein strategies, but about specific technological investments as part of those strategies. So you might have heard about the National Growth Fund in the Netherlands and its investment into cellular agriculture. And we want to dig in a bit more into that, like how did that come about? Next, we have Koen Dillen. He is head of unit on arable crops and olive oil at DG Agri at the European Commission. And he has been really leading this whole exploration of what could an EU protein strategy look like, where that has gone so far. Maybe he will tell us a bit more of what we can expect. Thank you for joining us. And then we have Maria Lisa Meurice. She is leading the protein diversification think tank at EIT Food. EIT Food, some of you will know, is really one of the leading networks on innovation and research in the food space, and so very curious to get that perspective of how innovation can contribute to this transition. Thank you so much for joining us. Great. We have microphones in front of you, and I'm just quickly getting my glass because I'm going to get thirsty with all our discussions. And so we spent now about 40 minutes discussing during the panel, and then we'll definitely want to make time for audience questions. So if you have questions during the panel, please note them down, and we'll have a microphone going around to give you the chance to ask questions. Please, yes. Great, thank you. I want to start with you, Maria Lisa, next to me. Yeah, I mentioned it that at EIT Food you've created and founded this, this think tank initiative around the topic of protein diversification. Could you talk a bit about how that came about, why you decided together with partners that that's a priority, and yeah, tell us a bit more on what the focus is.
Okay. Yes,
and take the microphone.
Oh my goodness, I have to keep two things in my hand, so I will put my glasses if I don't need them. Yes, hello, very honored to be today, first of all, here in this panel and seeing all of you. I hear that it is a very good group of people here, and very interested in these obviously strategies for protein diversification, and it is not a very minor topic indeed. Why EIT Food? Why we came around this topic? I mean, I could probably tell you as well that by looking at all the opportunities, innovation opportunities on agri-food area, this came very, very clearly that we should definitely be interested in. Not only about all those investments throughout the world that are around billions, at least in dollars, that in private sector has been investing in there, but equally in the fact that when we talk with our scientists, it was very clear that basically protein diversification could be one of actually the most efficient way going forward when it comes to creating sustainable food systems. Now, these were kind of like around the strategy building that we had, and then our partners, because EIT Food is actually a network of all the very knowledgeable expertise partners from universities, so academia, research centers, industry, startups, NGOs like yourself, and so therefore there was kind of like a unanimous desire to build something around this one, and so we said that okay, if we are not going to tackle this question, together with the EU, our friends in EU institutions, and also like in the countries, in the regions, then well, we will be leaving us out completely of this very, very important topic. Now, we said also that why do we need to do this think tank? I mean, or what should we do? I mean, it was not very clear in the beginning that, okay, well, should we indeed go like for projects only, fund and accelerate the project building? But then we said that there's actually something that is not quite right. Like, how is it that, let's say that in Europe, we are investing a lot of money in R&D on these areas. We have a lot of startups that are financed. How come that, we are not able to actually make the breakthrough in the market, or like have at least some kind of a, maybe even a common view? I mean, this is obviously a lot to ask, but some kind of a common view what needs to be done. And we realized that there are barriers. And some of these barriers are probably very simple to solve. It's more like, maybe changing some systems that we have that would correspond better to the things we need to do now, and not like 70 years ago, or 50 years ago, or 20 years ago. Some of these barriers are rather, high, and kind of almost like invisible, but it means that we need to build something around there. And this was why we said that, okay, you know, we are putting all this expertise that we have within EAT Food, all these scientists, all these, you know, industry people, NGOs, everybody together to think about that what needs to be done. And so, indeed, they came up with the idea that, you know, we need to build a think tank. Not only think, but also do. So it's actually a think and do tank. And this has been now going on about a year and a half. We have, indeed, like if you may, I will try to be short then, but published actually 2 papers. One was kind of like a first white paper, and then last October we published actually a policy recommendation paper, which you can also download on our website, so no problem with that one. I think we should have actually a slide so you can even download it and look at it. It is really the outcome of this kind of a work, thinking, what needs to be done. And maybe one more key word that I like very much, why this was important, is that we actually realized that we need to build a systemic approach. So there's not like one silver bullet, as we say, not one solution that is going to help us to actually find the solution. This is a systemic approach change that is required, and therefore it actually really means that we need everybody on board. But this is really exciting. I'm going to talk about it maybe a little bit later, but these were the reasons. And we know that, you know, we have obviously some, you know, if we want to be in a doomsday thinking, is that, you know, we have really serious challenges that we need to overcome. And then some of them are actually great opportunities. So it's not all like, you know, oh, it's very dark. No, it isn't dark at all. We just need to get things done. And we need to go through those innovations, build the opportunities, the capabilities, because it's going to provide also possibilities for throughout the whole food value chain for everybody. And so this is why we are absolutely excited about it. There's actually, even if I can mention, I don't know, Peter, if you mind, Peter Hall from Deal, who is here, and also like I think other people as well from Think Tank. And please do look at the report. It's really excellent work and includes a lot of stakeholders there.
Thank you so much, Marie-Lise. And I put the slide up, so if you're interested in reading the policy paper, take a look at that. We'll dive in more into the innovation questions in a second. Evelyn, I want to go next to you. I mentioned you've been in charge, if I can say that, or at least coordinating around the Flemish protein strategy. And that's a strategy that actually, it has already started to being implemented. It had a time frame from 2021 to 2030. So you've already done, I think, a lot of the work that maybe others that representing governments in this room are just at this point thinking about doing. So yeah, can you talk a little bit about how this strategy came about and how you've figured out that that's something a country like or a region like Flanders really needs?
Yeah, first of all, a lot of work still has to be done, I think most of it. It's of course not my work, it's a work of a broad coalition, and then I already give the answer which of the 2 strategies that we applied, so we chose for a broad coalition. And I see myself of my agency as a facilitator, so we bring all partners together and we try to learn from each other's perspectives, because we think we have to look from the very start from different perspectives to this protein diversification. Because it means something completely different if you talk to a farmer or you talk to someone else in the food chain, a processor or consumer, or if you talk to other governments in charge of environment, climate, health. They see something, other opportunities in it, and every opportunity comes with a certain condition. I don't like to talk about hurdles, but it's a condition to achieve this opportunity. For example, for farmers, of course, they would see it as a threat if you only talk about protein, that we have to diversify our protein consumption, because also the production should be local if we want to involve them in the protein diversification. So the local aspect is really important, that we don't want to replace imported, or we don't want to replace local produced animal proteins by imported plant proteins. That's very important to reassure them that that's not the goal of our strategy. If you talk about with environmental NGOs or governments, they say, yeah, we agree that we can produce them locally, but it has to be produced in a responsible way. When we talk about legumes, for example, of course they are able to fix nitrogen from the air, but to use this capacity, we don't have to give them too much fertilizers or no fertilizers at all. If not, they won't fix nitrogen from the air. You won't make a meal for yourself if you can go to restaurants. So that's the same comparison. And from a health perspective, the same. If we replace like our meat, and meat can be really processed as well, but if we replace them by plant burgers with more than 25 ingredients in them, that's the so-called ultra-processed foods. We have to be aware that we don't take that road either. So every perspective comes with a certain condition, and therefore we think, but we are not sure yet, it's better to reunite all these perspectives and conditions from the start. If not, you will encounter one of the walls or the perspectives later on. And we also have a really broad focus. So we do not focus on plant-based proteins alone. We also focus on new proteins and on animal proteins. Because animal proteins will always be a part of our diet, average diets. It's a really good protein when we look at amino acids and so forth. But of course, animal production can be, or animal proteins can be produced in another way, where animal proteins or animal production becomes a better part of a circular economy, where we use more side streams, for example, to feed them, where we use more grasslands instead of imported soy. One of our goals or one of our themes is also animal production and how to make it more circular. So we have in total 29 goals, and those are all like smart defined, and most of them are quantified as well, to know like where do we want to end up. But of course it wasn't an easy task, and there is still a lot of work to do, because we already took some actions, but if the actions are enough to meet those quantified goals, we do not know yet. So this year we start with the monitoring, and we will see, are we on track, or where do we need more actions? Can we take more actions? Because sometimes contexts, we cannot always act ourselves. Sometimes the context decides that it's not achievable, and then we have to re-look at the goals. So that's a bit of our strategy now.
Great, thanks so much. And yeah, we'll dive into a bit more questions there around governance, around how did you actually build that broad group of stakeholders to agree on not just on a vision, but on objectives and targets, which I think often is a challenge when we try to operationalize these ideas. Thank you for that. Simone, I would love to hear a bit about the Dutch case, and maybe not focusing too much on the protein plan that also exists in the Netherlands. There is a protein plan that the Ministry of Agriculture has put forward, and from my reading also has a fairly broad approach and takes a lot of different protein sources into account. But in that context, the Netherlands and the Dutch government has made one of the, if not the largest, public investments in what we call cellular agriculture, so cultivated meat, precision fermentation. How did this come about, and what's the idea behind it from a Dutch perspective?
Well, thank you for the question. We indeed have a national strategy for proteins, and one of the pathways within that strategy is the encouragement of innovation. And actually the Dutch government set up this innovation fund. It's called the National Growth Fund. And within that growth fund, you can actually apply for projects. within, for instance, agriculture. And so we started to talk to the cellular agricultural sector, which is quite small still, but with some companies, some universities, some NGOs. And we actually set up this plan how to, for the ecosystem more or less, to develop cellular agriculture. And that was actually in a second term was granted to this consortium. And this consortium focuses now its project, so 60 million euros are being invested in education, research, and upscaling. And especially that last part is very difficult to achieve. So we're still working on a plan, a more detailed plan, how to do this in the right way. Also how to do this in a way that actually startups can use it, so open access. But secondly, also, how can we make a facility that is actually, because the whole growth fund is for 8 years. And so how can we make a facility that actually, after those 8 years, can actually, have the economic, they have the business case for itself, and not only use governmental funding. And that is the most difficult question. So that is actually the plan that we're working on, because we, from the Dutch government, we believe that we should focus not only more on the mainstream agriculture, but we should also look for new ways and sources, also to provide our, within Europe, I believe, the food security, to make sure, the level of, that we are, the world population is still growing, and so we need more protein sources than we can now produce in a, also a bit unsustainable way, I guess.
Brilliant, thanks so much. And we'll get a bit more to, again, how the decision-making leading up to that kind of investment actually looked like. Koen, you have, at DG Agri over the past year or so, really led the process of figuring out, okay, at the EU level, do we need another new approach to protein? It was called the protein strategy before. It's now morphed maybe into something else. It's a document that is still not out, but can you talk a bit about why this process was started and what you've learned so far?
No, thanks a lot for the invitation. And of course, it's always very hard to be the last one, because a lot of good things have been said. But indeed, we have been working hard over the last year or so in the Commission, looking again, and that's what I want to stress, again at protein. Because when we started preparing, we went through the older documents, and then I came across a document of 2011 from the European Parliament said, the protein deficit, a problem to a long-standing issue. So even in 2011, it was a long-standing issue, and even today, when we did the poll, let's say, you saw still this theme of autonomy was probably the dominant one, and I was surprised by that, I have to admit. So then there has been a series of documents, and at the latest in 2018, there was a report to the Parliament and the Council from the Commission, which indeed was very much focused on, okay, we have this deficit, we are importing too much soybean, to be bluntly, and how can we solve that? And then if you look at that report in 2018, it was all about setting up a supply chain for protein, plant protein grown in Europe. It was how can we create the incentives, how can we support farmers doing that, how can we get the research and innovation directed, etc. But that, of course, and I think that rationalization has come much more, and then you see it in the farm to fork, you see it in what we just discussed in the session before, is that just setting up or changing the supply side of things will not provide you with a lasting solution. So, and that's indeed, in the farm to fork, you for the first time you have this food systems approach in it. And it's not only about the supply, it's, to put it simply, it's about how do we produce and consume protein, and how can we make steps there. And what I always find very telling is this isn't a very important change in the narrative. And even in our food security communication in 2022, immediately after the Russian aggression against Ukraine, it says the way we produce protein is essential. I would have to look at the exact drafting, but it's part of the change of our food system towards resilience and sustainability. So even in a communication on food security, which would be autonomy and we have to produce ourselves, etc., it's recognized that we also have to look at these other elements. So that's what we have been doing for the last year, is how do we integrate these other elements? What can we do there? And unfortunately, the moment you make the problem more complicated, also the solution becomes more complicated, because you start having all kinds of trade-offs in your discussion. Because what is a good way of producing protein? What is a good way of consuming protein? And then both on the livestock side and also on the human side. You have to make trade-offs between economy, you have environment, greenhouse gas, I split out those two, about health, about all these things entail trade-offs. And it also very clearly then, very quickly shows you that there's not one silver bullet solution. There's not one thing you can do, and then we solve the problem. I think that was also very clear from the survey you did, because if you ask what needs to be done, you see a variety of things. It's about farmer income, it's about demand, it's about consumer, it's about trade. All these things come back. And that's good, but it also makes it very challenging, of course. And that's why I like so much the things that we have heard here also before, and I hope that we can dive in a little bit, is that we need all these little incremental steps. It was a question of you. I think that's what we need to do. We need all of us in that system, and I'm saying all of us because we're all consumers, so we are part of that. We have to make that progress, and everybody has to look for their part. What can we do? And that's why I like this, in the first session, this use of lighthouses, living labs, etc. I think by cooperating and taking steps together, things can be changed, and that's what we want to say. And then in your questionnaire, I don't think there's a contradiction. I think in some areas we can go very fast, very quick with the willing, but we have to make sure that we get everybody on board and make this just transition, because we need farmers, we need everybody to be part of that story. Because then, and then I stop for my first part, but I think that's the choice we have in this debate. For me, the protein transition, if we can call it like that, it's a positive story. It's a story full of opportunities. And that's the storyline that we have to have for everyone. Because you have the choice. Either you say, we try to work on this together, we try to create solutions together in the chain, and we'll come to some of the solutions, or you make it an antagonizing discussion. It's plant-based versus livestock. The one is better than the other. But that will not bring us anywhere. I think that's where we have to get everybody on board, everybody in the system, and then we see which speed, and then of course we'll also see what role of policy can be there. But we'll come back to that.
Thanks so much. I want to just pick up on that, but how do we do that? And I think I want to go to you, Evelyn, in a second, but before Koen, I want to ask you, presumably that's what you've tried when you did this exploration over the last year. Like, you've run into all these complexities. You've also realized, actually in 2011 already, we recognized these challenges, the European Parliament recognized it. So that's been, 13 years ago. Why are we where we are now and not already a few steps further ahead? And also, where are we with the European protein strategy?
I think because some of the elements that we have identified, they're not easy to do. Again, we saw consumers. Then you see terms coming up like education. I'm all in favor of education, but it takes time. Yeah. We are... and that was also said in the first session, food is about culture, it's about diets, it's about the recipes we use. 60 years ago, the share of meat in our food was very small in Europe, but we have forgotten about all these recipes. And there's a big systemic change that has to be made on all these pillars. But we are also realizing that those are probably the hardest part from a policy angle to tackle. Yeah. Because it's easier to give, to give a subsidy to a farmer to produce protein crops. That's much easier than telling a consumer from now on you eat like that, because a policy that tells you that, it will not get a lot of votes. So it's much more complicated, and that's why I also think that we need everybody on board, and everybody needs to do his little step, and we need to have this positive story with a direction, because I think we can all agree on where we have to go. The question is more, how do we do that with everybody on board, I think. And then on the work, no, so indeed, I think first on the name, I know this. I know that there was always a lot of talk about the protein strategy, but we wanted to follow up similar to the report what we did in 2018, which was a report to the Parliament and Council. I know this is very formalistic, but therefore it's not a strategy. I think the content will be the same, but we, that's the format it will take. And then, unfortunately, on the publication date, I cannot yet give you a clear publication date. But what I always say is that that's not the most important to me. Of course, it's important, and I hope that everybody can soon read it. But what we need is this dialogue. Yeah. And we have all these processes, the structured dialogue on agriculture. We have the preparation of the new college. We have the preparation in not so long time about the new CAP. And we have to have this narrative in, we have to have this reflection in. That's to me the most important. For me, myself, as what I can do in DG Agri is to bring this to the forefront and make sure it's not forgotten. And then the report, it's nice, but it's not the most important.
Thank you. Yeah, we are eagerly awaiting it anyway, so thank you for that update. Evelyn, Cohen mentioned there that he thinks we actually agree on like the direction of travel. How has that been in your experience? Because you've worked, as you mentioned, as a facilitator within the Flemish government, right? So you had to take into account other ministries, environment, health, economy, lots of different stakeholders that we've seen on the audience questions from farmers, food manufacturers, consumers. When you started out with this project of creating a governmental protein strategy, how did you all agree on the direction of travel?
We started pretty softly, I guess, with a protein strategy who talks about, better world actually, by protein diversification, that it's an opportunity for everything, but we didn't talk about all the conditions that I mentioned before yet. So first we agreed on a pretty general text which gives a common direction, and we look at all proteins and we look at all the elements in the chain, and we really search for that value for every link in the chain. So of course everyone agreed on that, they put on their name on it, and it's the umbrella organizations of the different links in the food chain, and of course also the environment or the climate is represented by an NGO or an umbrella organization, and then the different governments from the different perspectives. So we have a common ground then, and then we came with more, we asked if they agree to have specific targets to get really into the depth, and they agreed. We formed different working groups around different teams, because every team needs a different thinking of target and different experts. For example, new proteins, plant proteins, the animal production, animal feed, but also, and we didn't talk, it was earlier in the QR, the processing of food, and the retail, how does it get to the consumer? Can we change something there? Because there is a difference between the choice that the consumer makes and the choice that the consumer has. And then, of course, the consumers themselves. So we divided it up in 6 different teams, and around every team we search for really smart targets. So that was the condition. Every target has to be mentioned in a smart way. That took about a year of parallel discussions, which really weren't easy. It's not like the really the smooth walking from the beginning. It was like pretty tough but constructive discussions. And then after a year, we ended up with these quantified goals. But for example, in the processing team, the goals are already smart formulated, but not yet quantified. So that's still work to do for this year. And I think maybe that's the most difficult team, because of course, retail or food or feed industry, they say, yeah, we follow the consumers, we follow what the consumer wants, but the choice that the consumer has can really influence its choice as well. So there we were still searching for a breakthrough to get to those specific targets, to have, for example, less meat in one package, or have more choice between plant proteins who aren't too processed. So I think that's still a challenge to get to these quantified goals. And of course, when you work together with a broad coalition, you have the phenomenon which is called like diffused responsibility. The bigger the group, the more you get to lay back, and I will see what is asked to me specifically, but you don't feel responsible for the end results. So that's a big challenge as well, that everyone feels ownership of the end results.
How are you dealing with that? How do you create that ownership?
Yeah, still struggling actually. Yeah. I think it's important, for example, for the different working groups, we ask gently, and then a more less gently, no. But we ask that they are in charge of the results of the working group. So the different organizations, we aren't president of all the different reunions. That's not feasible either. So that way we create ownership by, for example, for new proteins, it was Flemish Food and Research Institute who were guiding the group through two quantified goals, or it was the environmental government who was in charge for the consumer goal targets, and they did a really amazing job. So that's how we try to create this ownership. Yeah.
That does sound like a lot of work and quite a bit of effort. And I'm just thinking how that would look like at the EU level, at the national level, so that, and like not just intergovernmental, right, but or within a government between different departments and taking all these other actors on board. I do want to add a complication to that. I'm curious, how does the politics of this topic play into it? Because this is, I think, something we cannot really ignore. It was mentioned early on by Natasha. Not just that right now we live in a moment where discussions around agriculture and food policy are very polarized. We have protests of farmers, we have cost of living increases in lots of countries. But we've also had in the past this topic being a politically sensitive one. And from our bilateral conversations with different parts of different governments, there's a huge recognition that if they touch this topic of diversifying protein, the topic of diets, the topic of new proteins, there is a certain caution and a certain being very sensitive that some risk of backlash can occur from some parts of the existing conventional production systems that feel threatened by this. And I think, Cohen, you mentioned a bit the narratives that we need, but how has that played a role in the Flemish case?
By really making protein diversification a really positive theme, like playing the opportunities, but especially, and that's why I always emphasize that our agency is not owning the national strategy, because it's a strategy of all the partners together. So there are no, it's the targets as well, those are not governmental targets, and that's really important. So we decided on these targets together, and those are, in Dutch we say streefdoelen, so sometimes the phrasing is really important as well, that those are not targets of which you will be sanctioned if you don't reach them. No, those are targets we strive, how do you say it? Strive at, and not targets who are really written in stone, and we will get punished if we don't reach them. So that's a really important aspect, I think, to always reassure, we just have these targets to have a direction for the actions, and the actions can mean more money as well. So actions don't always have to hurt. If there is a problem reaching a certain target, we can also go to the political level and say, like, here we see that we have difficulties to reach these targets. The difficulties are not contextual, it's not geopolitics. We can really reach them with more money for this research, or with a new project call, specifically focus on that. So that way it's everyone, wants these targets as well. So
thanks, that's great. And you mentioned funding there and resourcing, and I want to pick up on that in a second.
Yeah.
But first, Simone, this political aspect, like, if I would be someone who doesn't know the Dutch context, but I know a bit about like the Netherlands, one of the largest agricultural exporters in the world, huge intensive livestock industry, very proud of its like agricultural productivity, right? It's very ingrained. And so we've seen, but then this investment that you described of the National Growth Fund.
Yeah.
what was the politics around that? Was there a reaction to it that you didn't anticipate? How did that look like?
Well, actually, we had the help of the fact that it was a growth fund decision. So that is really a decision made by a big committee of high-standing, high-level people looking at the proposal, and they actually advised our government to take the decision to fund this. There was not much response given to it, actually not much resistance, but we see now on a European level there's a lot of resistance against cultivated meat, for instance. And what we are now, actually the time is right to actually start the dialogue also, for instance, with farmers to see what perspectives there are for them to participate in the production of cultivated meat. And we actually are working together with a society organization called Respect Farms, and they are setting up this study now to see if they can set up this, how do you call it, this lab, this kind of a proefboerderij. It's a farm that is actually made for farmers also to come to and to see the possibilities for them to actually change their own farm and what is needed and actually how to produce cultivated meat on their own land. Because we believe that in terms of the diversification, it's not just the difficulty with cultivated meat, for instance, is that you have small bioreactors. We can still make the cultivated meat now in smaller, but if you really want to have the world population eating cultivated meat, we have to have a lot of bigger amounts. And so only focusing on these big, high-level industrial bioreactors, it's not going to work. So we have to diversify also the sources where we can have the production. So we have to include the farmers and show them the possibilities. We had dialogues with them. A movie was actually made, and now we're actually setting up this kind of this farm where it can actually be shown as a show model how the production of cultivated meat can be done actually on a smaller scale, and how to involve them.
That's super interesting, and it speaks to this need to involve and engage all the stakeholders in the chain, right? Maria-Lisa, on the opening panel, to this point of stakeholder engagement, on the opening panel, Director John Bell said, research and innovation is no longer an observer in food policy, but an actor. And I feel like, you've been working in R&I innovation for a long time. Do you feel that's true? Do you feel like when we think about who are the key actors, the key stakeholders that need to be active, but also need to be heard, and need to be taken into account when we do policy making on agri-food, research and innovation can or is recognized as that? How is that in your experience?
Well, I would say, it's a very, let's say, distinguished, area when we talk about R&D, and the people who are working in there are often, really top of the top. So now, how their work is then considered and heard, so that it's not like R&D that is kind of like a proposing, but actually we see it nowhere, or we see it in very rare cases coming, for example, to the market. And I think this is one of the, in a way, challenges as well that, we in the world, we have often this kind of a way of seeing a little bit like, or building silos. And what is really important now is that when we are talking about whether it is cell ag, which is absolutely important way forward and looking at the innovation in that area, but also how do we see these fruits of the R&D, for example, helped to come to the market? What kind of a market are we actually building them? Because it's not about once again, and it's not about R&D, let's say per se, probably to think about the business side, but there should be somewhere a conversation, exchange, and kind of understanding that, why are we doing this one? Now, I would not put it either only on the market side, because indeed, consumers, for example, they often, we buy what we sometimes can, and sometimes only what there is, okay? But then it is also about seeing and building those markets in a way that the R&D has access, and the market has access to the R&D. And why I'm saying this one, I mean, this is, this is all already true. Yes, it is partially true. But when it comes to this kind of really disruptive things, like, if we talk about cell ag or other products, it's quite a huge stretch that should be there. Now, also that, yes, we have startups. I think I mentioned it earlier that, we have startups, we have scale-ups. But how come, for example, that all those fruits of the R&D that some of these scale-ups and startups are building, cannot make it to the market in EU? And there are like several reasons, obviously, for that. And this is not to, pinpoint anybody or institutions in particular, but it is also to say that, why do we invest if we don't make sure that, these things actually can live and find their way to the market? What is happening today is that, within EAT Food, for example, we had many great results in R&D. I mean, we fund R&D research in many areas of the agri-food sector. We also invest in startups and in scale-ups. And we have really, if I tell you now, we have about like probably 5 absolutely brilliant startups and scale-ups that have gone through not only of EAT Food, obviously, but some of the programs that we are funding. And then, what happened is that, they are really making great progress. Their product is, ready to be launched, in a way, ready to be launched. But what happens is that, obviously, the processes, whether it is novel foods particularly, it is rather slow for several reasons, because at the same time, we have this really valued food in Europe. We are all the time looked up and said, European food is safe. It's really well, the whole process is actually protecting also consumers. But what if we protect ourselves so much that, we are actually like building another silo there? Because what happens is that these scale-ups and startups, they go to America or they go to Singapore. Now, maybe they will come back, and hopefully they do. But the fact is that, there's a kind of like a huge gap that is there somewhere that is not actually really benefiting the R&D, nor the business, nor for Europe to be a leader actually in this area. And that, so this is where the exchange and understanding has to also take place, that, it's an affair of all of us, It's not only in there. It is like we have all the interest as a consumers, as a policymakers, to also look at the whole chain. How does it happen from in this case, from R&D and to the market? And if there are any gaps there that actually really are hindering the success to happen. And this is unfortunately a little bit the case today.
Yeah. And you mentioned that the competitiveness angle, and they're like, let's look how we as the EU and as Europe can compete with other regions that are investing in this kind, not just investing, but actually creating the enabling conditions. Simone, you mentioned the growth fund, and that being a key of, it was not just, and I don't want to say just in a negative way, but it was not just something like the agriculture ministry in the Netherlands said, oh, maybe this is something we should do, but there was an overarching framework around the Dutch government looking for key sectors to foster for like green growth in the future. And that was the frame, that was the lens through which the government looked at different sectors, including agriculture, and that's how you come in. Is that something you would recommend others to replicate? If that's something we look at progress on this topic at the EU level, for example, maybe has been a bit slower. Is this something that you think could be a way forward?
Yes, but I also have to mention that also in the Netherlands it took time. I mean, now it seems like, oh, we had a growth fund, oh yeah, let's do that cellular agriculture, but it wasn't the case. I mean, I have colleagues working at my ministry for quite a long time already, and they said to me, oh, you're going to work on cultivated meat? It will take a while. And so now I think the time was right, because more and more people are starting to notice that, okay, for food security, but also environmental reasons, and also for animal welfare, we have to look for different ways to produce our meat. And also, so in this case, and now the time was right, actually. We have some startups, some larger companies now working on it. We have universities picking up the topic. We have NGOs working on it, so there was actually an environment now that we can actually, and there was the possibility of the growth fund that came together, and then it was possible to have this investment. So just to make sure that you don't get the picture that it was easy, it takes time. All these developments really take time, but it helps if you don't do it solitarily, but make it part of a larger strategy involving all kinds of pathways. So our national protein strategy has 5 pathways, and innovation is just one of them.
Okay, that's super clear.
Alex, can I
Sure.
just quickly add there? One important thing is that, those strategies are really important, and that when we talk about also national agri-food strategies, or roadmaps, they actually don't really exist in many countries. Like yours is Danish government. I think that they have actually come up with one, and forgive me if I'm not mentioning your country. If you have one, forgive me, because maybe I'm not aware of. But quite frankly, often these strategies are really done, in a very separate silos in different ministries. That's okay, but at some point, and especially now when we are looking at those kind of like systemic approach, there should be like some kind of understanding and agreement that, these are the lines that we are going to follow. This is the direction we want to go, and then everyone agrees behind it. And that's then going to create a very, very positive, outcome. We have seen it already, but if there's no such a discussion, then everyone is doing their best, in the framework which has been given to them. And today, this is simply not the way forward. And that is extremely positive, and the outcomes are absolutely tremendous. I mean, in Netherlands, it's not easy. It doesn't go overnight. But if these national, let's say, agri-food strategies would be there, I think that we could be already, quite much further than we are today. So this is really something I encourage, and I think that this is actually the way also forward.
Great. Evelyn, before going to you, I just want to ask you to address this question of having a mandate to creating a common strategy like that. Because I think that's something, I'm curious how that worked in the Flemish case. You mentioned you have the facilitating role, but in lots of other governments, at least we as GFI work with across Europe, there doesn't exist like that one point of contact, that one team or unit that holds the pen or holds the responsibility to do that coordinating work across departments that is necessary. How do you solve that?
How did we get that facilitating role? I think we invented it for ourselves within the administrations, and then like political level saw that it works, so they picked it up. It was pretty much that way. So it's maybe a daring strategy that doesn't work everywhere that way, but that's how we did it. But I wanted to talk about. We speak a lot about a common direction and a common ground and a common strategy, but I think the real challenge is to adapt also the instruments to that strategy, giving the guidance what is really needed to create these value chains in proteins. And there I see in Flanders, in Belgium, maybe in the Netherlands, at the EU level, still a lot of work has to be done. Because, as you said, like, everyone is looking at his own, maybe not his own benefits, but the instruments are really focused on their own public. Like, instruments are focused on farmers, instruments are focused or on consumers or on the economy, so the processing industries. But connecting these instruments, we managed once to do so, but by a separate call, which is not ideal, because that's a lot of work, a lot of errors as well, because we are not used to do such a call. And now I think the European innovation partnerships, and especially the cooperation part, I don't know if every member state uses it, but that's a really good instrument who finally looks at the cooperation within the whole agri-food chain, because that's really what we need to get this economic access for new proteins, and I think European innovation partnerships are really great instruments, but for the moment that's the only instruments we have where cooperation is really obliged. And instruments are really, everyone is looking at his own opportunity and his own condition, but we don't work enough together on a governmental level for the instruments itself. For the strategies, yes, but instruments not. Maybe in the Netherlands.
Very briefly, Simone, then I want to go to you, Koen, and then I want to go to audience questions because I'm sure there are lots of other questions.
Just a quick addition to what you're saying. Indeed, I also recognize, because that is one of my questions for myself, working on innovation. The whole department, our ministry looks at, oh, it's still innovative, very good, you're dealing with it, and we don't have to deal with it. But now we have to look for ways, how does cellular agriculture, for instance, what kind of place does it have in the food system that we are working towards? And so how to make it more the mainstream policy. That, of course, the sector is still very young, so we're not there, but we have to think about this now. And indeed, not in my silo as working on innovation. How does innovation become mainstream? And when is the right moment to actually involve my policy colleagues to work with cellular agriculture as well? Because now, at the moment, I'm the only one working in the whole ministry on this topic.
Fascinating. On that topic of breaking down silos, and I want to talk about resourcing just very briefly. Tim Searchinger mentioned in the panel, the test is where the money is spent in the end. And of course, in the EU, we have an innovation funding system that John Bell outlined earlier. We have the Common Agricultural Policy in terms of agricultural subsidies. Koen, have you looked at that? How do you look at these different silos, these different streams of resourcing in agri-food, and how, on this question of protein, how they could all play their part?
Yes, I mean, that's indeed, I mean, it's a clear difficulty. Yeah? I'm the first to admit that it's very difficult to get all policy instruments on the same direction, because then, of course, you already assume that there is an individual direction, and everything we said is that there's a lot of angles to work on, and so probably also for instruments, there's some instruments that are very good for this, there are other instruments that are very good for that. So, but then I agree, and it actually came up again on your Slido as well, that you have to make sure that there's coherence. That at least you create an environment that you don't have one policy which goes against another policy, I would say. I think that's the least you can strive for, because then you create an environment where everything I heard, where innovation or research can become innovation, and then innovation can be rolled out, can be scaled up, etc. And I think that's what we should achieve from a policy angle, that we can say, okay, this is our coherent view for the future. We have different instruments, and then every instrument can have its own strength. So also in the CAP, and I think there is already a lot of attention for protein crops, protein transition. You can always argue that it's not enough. I mean, that's fine, because the CAP, in the end, is out of this mix of instruments we have is focusing on the farmer. And there we already have quite a bit that really makes explicit this role of protein crops then in particular, and the importance. So we have this, what we now call the coupled income support, where specifically for the protein, if you want to give that as a member state, you want to give support for a farmer to grow protein crops, you don't have to, let's say, prove the reason why you're doing that. In principle, for all the other sectors, when you want to give coupled support, you have to explain that it's a sector in difficulties, that is declining, etc. No, for protein crops, we say, fine. Then we have in this whole rotation system that we introduced, there's an important role for protein crops. Then there's a lot of eco schemes on extensive livestock, on growing protein crops. And then there's a list of other things that can be done, but unfortunately the uptake is not yet there. We have created in this CAP reform the opportunity to set up sectorial organizations for protein crops, which wasn't the case, which again is an instrument that would then allow for cooperation and organizing the sector. Only 2 member states have chosen this. I'm not blaming the member states, but I think there are tools. But what you need is indeed this vision on why, as a member state, would I use these tools, and why does that have priority over what else I can do with the CAP money? And those are the trade-offs that need to be made, and then we're back at these trade-offs, because indeed those will need to happen. And that's where I'm taking the liberty to jump to an earlier question of you, where you said, okay, but how does the politics come in? And I think that's really the role of politics, of society, is to identify these trade-offs and then decide about them. Because if you start looking into the detail of a lot of the challenges we focus, there is no silver bullet. If we talk about, we go back to the autonomy, if we see where the soybean goes, if we take that angle, it's mainly, and it was part of the exercise that we tried to dig out and put those facts on the table, it's mainly going to the big meat sector and the poultry sector. But then we have seen on the slides of Professor Searchinger that actually for the climate angle, it's not too bad, poultry and the pork. And then you have the whole social debate on who is then producing, etc. And all these trade-offs have to be made. And that is the role of politics and society, I think. And that's what we have to do, and it's not easy.
Fair enough. We need more politics. I want to end the panel discussion here. I want to already give a big round of applause to you for this. But I want to make sure that we have enough time for questions from the audience to the panel. So we will do another round of questions via Slido. But we have now someone with a microphone going around. So if you could just raise your hand. We have one question here. Maybe let's go there first.
Okay.
We go to Peter second. We start with you, please. Yeah. Okay. No, please go ahead.
Okay. Oh, sorry. So I'm Lisbeth Jacksons from Ghent University, Department of Food Technology, Safety and Health. I'm a little bit was touched upon it, but I miss a bit the discussion about food safety, because if we talk about innovations on the one hand, and on the other hand, the shift in the diets, we have to look also, well, microbial, but surely the chemical food safety and new contaminants that we are exposed to. Yeah, I don't know who wants to say something about that, or did we miss it somewhere, or I don't see it so often. It's also not there in the Flemish strategies. Nowhere I see it very much touched upon. We did some calculations. Exposure assessment is one of my expertise. We're doing calculations and, well, think about mycotoxins, nickel, which is coming up. Yeah, we have a bunch of new contaminants which are reaching us with this protein diversification.
Yeah, we have in the EU, of course, food safety roots. Maria-Lisa, do you want to
Yeah, it's just
that?
a very general, I'm sure that, maybe somebody even could provide a more accurate and more precise, so indeed, it is very important. I mean, there's no I think, trade-off on the question of food security from the question of really like, microbes and this is kind of like comes with I think with the package really. As I said earlier, is that we can be very proud of a kind of a European, let's say, level of food safety. Really, I think it is really fantastic. We are looked up really in many fronts. That what is the approach. We have absolutely fantastic research also in this area. If I'm looking at EAT food, many of our members in the academia have a food security area, and obviously in the national levels, they are very much in control and controlling their programs and projects forward and what they are proposing. So I don't have a feeling, at least, that this area is neglected. Maybe at the moment, it's not necessarily maybe presented in a way that, okay, what are these results? And I think this is probably work that simply needs to be exposed, because I'm sure that it is done.
Maybe from more specific perspective from cellular agriculture, it is obviously a very important part of actually marketing products from cellular agriculture. Currently, no company at least in the Netherlands, and I think not even in Europe, has started the whole EFSA procedure. What I heard is that it's a very difficult procedure, and it's kind of like a black box. That is what the companies say. They don't know. They can't have a real discussion with the company, with the Commission. Really explaining and asking, etc. So that is one of the things that companies at least say. Please, Dutch government, can you help us with that? That's a bit difficult. But I think what we do in the Netherlands, also we're now setting up these tasting sessions, not we as a government, but companies. We set up this code of practice together with the companies to see if they can have tastings which are prior to actually the whole EFSA procedure. And an independent committee of experts are actually looking at the safety of these tastings. So they investigate the document that is actually sent by the companies to this committee to actually investigate whether or not the tasting can be held safely. So in each stage, we try to involve food safety, and it's really a relevant topic. So thank you for raising the question.
Can we just, sorry, I do want to get to the question. Kun, you just, yeah.
No, I just wanted to, I mean, not very long, but on this, I think it's a very good point. And what I always like is that we should keep on stressing that our food in Europe is among the safest. I don't want to say the safest, but at least among the safest in the world. And in an audience like this, and now this seems judging, but I hear a lot of people that are coming from the novel proteins, the new proteins, new technology. And very often I find it a pity that we then portray some of the safety regulation we have as only a hurdle. It can be done only in Singapore, investment will go. It can only be done in the US. I think and here I'm not saying that some of the processes that are there could be done quicker and we can look at that. I'm not saying, because it has to be clear on how you get to the market, it can maybe be accelerated, etc. I'm not saying, but the fact that when something is approved in Europe, when it's on the market in Europe, it opens still a lot of doors in the world, because not every country has its own food safety assessment, etc. The European market is still kind of sometimes like a golden ticket. If you are allowed to sell it in the EU, a lot of markets open. And we should also sometimes value that. Then we can come to the process, etc. But we should, safety and how we save our food system is something that we should be proud of, I think.
Thank you so much. I do want to stop the safety question here because I do want to go to other questions. Peter, you had a question up here.
Thank you. Peter from the German Institute of Food Technologies. We have here a wonderful panel on a regional, national, and European level. And I think we can all agree that we would like to see acceleration on the protein translation and coherence. We have now in June new elections on the European level, so there's a new parliament, a new setup. If I would like to ask you for your wishes, what instruments, what panels, what formats would you like to see to get faster, starting with your good best practice experiences? So it's a real question, and maybe it does face only 3/4 of the panel.
Thanks so much, and we can limit the answers to 1 minute per person. Thank you.
I think very quickly, maybe we have sometimes to think more fork to farm than farm to fork. A lot of effort is being, a lot of instruments exist for the beginning of the chain, but I think the end of the chain, we don't dare to touch them because then we touch the consumers and it's politically sensitive. Maybe sometimes we have to dare to try out some new instruments for consumers, but also for the processing industry. So I would tackle that more, yeah.
Well, I fully agree. And I think focus on not so much the consumers as a group, which is not a group, but I think also the food environment for them. Where do they choose their fruit from and how are the choices about? I think that, and to stimulate sustainability and healthy food choices there, I think that is very important. And indeed, also talking from my ministry, we are the Ministry of Agriculture, Nature and Food Quality. So food is on the end. And so the consumer is also on the end of our thinking. So I think it's really important for the EU also develop indeed instruments more for the food environment and the consumer side. Oh, you have.
No, thanks. No, I agree that we have to look at the whole chain. And if we did the survey, I saw a lot of pressure. I mean, a lot of demands from the farmers, and I saw a lot of demands from the consumer. And then the middle ground, you had two. They were clearly less. And I think that's where we have to make sure that we get the whole chain in action. And I think a lot of the ideas are there in the farm to fork, but we have not yet realized them. There were discussions on labeling, there were discussions on education, all the things we see coming back. There were discussions on a sustainable food framework. I think those are discussions that go into the right way, that we should not give up, but they are difficult. And that's why we are not yet there. But I think a lot of ideas are there. but we have to still work on them and make them operational.
Lisa, you want to?
Okay.
1 minute?
1 minute, okay, tough. Yeah, I think that, what is maybe something good about all these crises that we have been going through is simply the fact that agri-food and food sector is very much now in the center of attention. And I think we should at least try to make it so that it remains there. And these things are really important because often we were thinking that food is coming from the skies. Well, it actually doesn't. And it is really important to indeed push those, that innovation area, R&D, but also make sure that the funding is, very much in coherence with what we are trying to do when we are talking about how food is actually produced, consumed in the future. And so we talk about biotech, we talk about other areas where absolutely we need to have a better share of these fundings that are really maintained for the food. And so food is important. It's about our culture, it's about our, roots. And, we still need to eat every day, right? So that's very important.
Can I make one more remark to that? Just because we haven't touched upon the issue of pricing and true pricing. And I think that is really important. So I also hope that the European Commission will work. I think transparency is important, education is important, but I think we still, and that is very sensitive indeed, like you also said, the true pricing of food is so necessary to actually, for consumers to make the choice, to make more sustainable choices.
Thank you so much. I want to do one more question, and we had over there in the back, and want to keep it fairly brief because I do want to get to our last part of the session.
Yes, well, thank you very much for the discussion. I'm Anna Hanscho. I'm working for companies in the field of cultivated meat and precision fermentation. And there's something which is really very almost personally important to me, that the whole discussion we have in Europe on food safety, we have forgotten that we also have a duty called innovation principle. And no one of these companies, and I know many of them, has ever challenged, neither questioned how important food safety is. But we also have, and that's why I'm thankful for the whole point, which is now coming from the Netherlands, that we need additional protein sources. This is just reality. And I think the risk we have now, what we have now in Europe, which is concerning me the most, is what we have seen in the last Agrifish Council, is we see there information which is spread, which is just not correct. So if we base our decisions not on science, then I don't know where we will end in Europe. But these are European interventions. So if you look at cultivated meat, this is made in Europe. And the risk is very real that it will end up not in Europe.
Is there a question, Anna?
No, it's a comment.
Thank you. Thank you for that comment.
It was important to make.
Thank you for that comment. I want to go now back and re-look at some of the questions that we asked before. While we were answering questions, our colleagues from the conference have hopefully made it possible for us to now look at the question we asked before. These 5 questions around key elements of a national protein strategy. And you can all vote again, so please take out your phones again. And maybe in a very quick way this time, because we've already thought about this over the last 90 minutes, give us your ideas of what the most important elements should be. And they should appear here. Dialogue is certainly something we talked about a lot, and maybe a key in what we've seen in Flanders. Coherence. We see investment, education. That's one element we've seen already earlier. It's always good if we have a panel discussion and afterwards people think more dialogue is even needed. So that means we haven't exhausted all the topics we could have talked about. So I'm happy with that. Acceleration, plant-based protein, true pricing, Simone, the point you just made. And I think dialogue and coherence, it's a top line we can take from this. I'm going to move us on. Innovation, there in the middle. Going to move us on. And I'm actually looking at time. I'm going to skip the next question. I'm going to skip the European angle. Not that it's not important, Koen, because I think we've actually built already out why it's important and how the autonomy question plays a huge role. The coherence question will play a huge role, not just in terms of policy instruments, but also in terms of making coherent what is happening at the national level, making coherent what's happening at the European level. But I do want to get to our image from before. So this is the image we saw before. This is the result. Education, again, at the center. Innovation, I think, has held its ground. Health was a big one. Health doesn't appear to play a huge role here, maybe because we didn't focus on like these different topics. But I think we see some interesting additions and also some coherence over time. Let's skip the European question again. It's one of the very important ones. But I do want to get to this question of how doable is it to unite all those elements. So after having listened to some of the forerunners in terms of protein strategies, 1 for very hard, 5 for very easy, how feasible is it to do this? Okay, I feel like we have a bit of a shift so far. The very hard column definitely.
No, but it is at least the center is now, so it is more of a middle ground.
Koen, having listened to Evelyn's and Simone's intervention, do you think it should be more easy than you might have thought after the last year?
I think bringing it all together, I should take this. I think bringing it all together in one strategy is not the difficulty, because that's your question, right?
Yeah.
I think that's a necessity.
Yeah.
That's what we need to do, because otherwise we will not make a step, and we're back in looking at the supply chain, looking at the diet. So including that in one strategy, and I think our understanding has become much, much stronger over the last couple of years on how these things interlink and how they have to cooperate. But then the key question is, how easy is it to translate it and to make these big steps that you're asking for? There, I think it's still relatively difficult, but that's not your question.
Great, that we address in a different session. And let's compare those two. So I think very hard was actually very hard and very easy. The extremes were not very popular before, and now they're quite more popular. So some people became a bit more pessimistic, but the overall distribution, and I'm not going to pretend to do the statistics on the fly here. It has shifted a bit. Like the middle one wins out in the end. Okay, well, we're going to analyze all of that and share that with you afterwards. I do want to get to this last. I'm also going to skip the narrow coalition part, and I want to get to the last point, and that is the different actors in the value chain. So again, the question is, which of those farmers, food processors, manufacturers, retail and food service, or consumers do you think should be especially emphasized in any kind of governmental strategic approach to protein? Let's see how that might have shifted. See, consumers are still on top, even maybe with a slightly larger lead. Food processors and manufacturers, retail and food service made up some ground in relative terms. And the key question here is probably also what do we mean by focusing on them? Are they the main change makers that need to change a lot of the practices, or should they be put at the center in terms of supporting them, enabling them to play a role in the transition, right? Which I think we talked about. It's really crucial to make sure we enable farmers to have this just transition. Let's look at, so it's 40% consumers, 26, 21, food processors, retail, and then farmers. That's quite a big difference. Huh? Consumers made an even stronger lead, but farmers maybe less of a focus for this kind of strategy. Evelyn, when you reflect on those results, when you reflect on the discussion, I want to give you the last word.
Yeah.
What are you taking away from this?
Yeah, I do more agree with the second round than the first round. I think the key is really at the end of the chain, and the rest will follow. And that's crucial to create that value that farmers really need. So I'm really glad for the change. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. I think we will continue the discussion. We will go into some of the thematic discussions around microbial protein, around plant-based protein, around animal production, around food environments. But at this point, I want to just give a big round of applause for our panel of speakers. Thank you so much.